So it's my pleasure to introduce Amanda Dotseth, who is the curator here at the Meadows Museum. She completed her PhD in medieval art and architecture at the Courtauld Institute of Art and has held fellowships from the Fulbright Association, the Mellon Foundation, and the Spanish National Research Council. Currently, she's an associated scholar in the project, The Medieval Iberian Treasury in Context, Collections, Connections, and Representations on the Peninsula and Beyond, and a short-term collaborator on the ERC-funded project, Petrifying Wealth, the Southern European Shift to Masonry as Collective Investment in Identity, circa 1050 to 1300. She's contributed to a number of exhibitions here at the Meadows Museum, including Fernando Gallego and his workshop, the Altarpiece from Ciudad Rodrigo, Zurbarán, Jacob and his 12 sons, and El Greco, Goya, and A Taste for Spain, highlights from the Bose Museum. Some upcoming projects include Canvas and Silk, Historic Fashion from Madrid's Museo del Traje, and Art of Medieval Pilgrimage in Spain, an edited volume published by Breppels called Collective Display, Medieval Art Out of Isolation, which is forthcoming. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn this program over to Dr. Amanda Dotseth.
Thank you, Anne, and it's so great to see you all, even virtually, and it's great to see so many familiar faces. We're going to talk about an object today with which I think many of you are familiar because it entered the collection in 2016. But I should say we're not actually talking as much about the object as about the context that made it possible for that object to exist. The concept that when Anne and I were discussing this lecture series that we came up with was a kind of deep dive into a single object that will help you kind of understand the ways, the things that had to happen for it to be created when it was, and then what happened to it afterwards. So, you know, as you can see on the title side, I have 6 centuries in the life of an altarpiece, and I really like this idea of thinking of the kind of life of an object and not just what happens to it after it's made, but again, the circumstances that led to its creation. Let's see, it would help. There we go. So here it is, and you'll notice that it's attributed to Rodrigo de Sajonia, otherwise known as the Master of Sigena. I will usually refer to the artist as the Master of Sigena, and that's purely out of habit. I'll get to how we named him at a later, in the next lecture, so at a later point. Some main themes that I'm hoping we take away from this lecture, however, have to do with medieval women and the role of women in medieval society, particularly as patron of the arts. This is something that we're going to spend quite a bit of time with today. Another kind of theme is, the simplest way of putting it is, why do things look the way they do? This is a question that art historians often start with. Why does this look this way? And the answer to that question can lead you to stylistic questions. It can also lead you to questions about materials. But it's this kind of fundamental question we ask ourselves. And this kind of theme in my lecture is what I'm calling style as substance. So things looking the way they look is important. And even stylistic cues can be related to much broader concepts about kind of politics or identity. And we'll see that with all related to this wonderful piece. The other thing I'd like you to think about, and that relates to style as substance, let's say, is that we can't think, I'm going to encourage that we try not to think of history or style as a kind of, and the way they change as a linear or an evolution, in the sense that it only moves in one direction. Things don't always progress from one to the other. We tend to teach things this way, right? Medieval, Renaissance, Baroque, this sort of kind of linear, it's an evolution. And that we do that because it's hard for us to deal with ambiguities, right? But I think what we're going to celebrate a little bit today is when things don't fit nicely into boxes, and that refers to not only styles, but also the people who were responsible for them. So time to say goodbye to this wonderful painting and plunge ourselves back in time, if I can work this thing, to the beginning of our story, which is in the late 12th century. And our main protagonist here is the lovely Sancha of Castile. And this is a manuscript miniature. But if you can see my cursor, Sancha is there on the right. And I really love this portrait because there's no difference in scale. They're the same size, the same height. They're on the same beautiful throne. They're both elegantly dressed. They're both wearing crowns, and they're both actively engaged in conversation. We know this because of these, as I do this with my hands, we know this because of these wonderful speaking gestures. So this kind of miniature sets us up really well for this image of a queen, sets us up really well for understanding who Sancha of Castile is, and why, one of the reasons she is still well known today. Sancha, so she was from Castile, which you see in the yellow area, and she was actually the daughter of Alfonso VII, who was actually considered himself an emperor. And you can see how big the kingdom of Castile had become, this yellow area, by the time period we're talking about. But she marries Alfonso I of Aragon, and that's in the pink area here. And you'll notice that by this point, the Crown of Aragón also includes, I mean, it goes all the way down south here to Valencia, and it includes Barcelona as well. So at different periods in time, we talk about Catalunya versus Aragon, but in this period, everybody is all together. So we're dealing with one of the most powerful kingdoms in Iberia. And the focus today is on the place that our wonderful panel comes from and why it was known as by the Master of Sigena for so long. So really the importance of this story is where this altarpiece came from. It is how it was described for its entire life. And that's because there are no other works attributed to this artist from places other than Sigena. So Master of Sigena is actually a useful moniker in this sense, because it ties this object to its place. And so that's what I'm focusing on today, is this place, this wonderful royal monastery of Santa Maria de Sigena, which is in Huesca in Aragon. The monastery was founded by Sancha of Castile, this wonderful queen I was telling you about, who became the Queen of Aragon. And I love this idea that, you know, she decides to found a monastery. So I've put up some kind of really basic ideas of, you know, how to found a monastery 101. Like, what do you do? And I should just say that as an elite woman, Sancha is in many ways extraordinary. And what she does is in many ways extraordinary. But what she does isn't necessarily extraordinary for a queen. Late 12th century queens, and certainly into the later centuries, very often did found monastic institutions. This is not entirely strange, but the things she did in many cases are very interesting and very telling. And I should say, this is Aragon, not Castile. We have a lot more documentation, thank goodness. And she signs all of her documents. Many of them are signed with her husband, but as we'll see later, she's really the driving force behind this, and the documentation makes that clear. So what do you do if you're sitting around and you're thinking, okay, I'm queen, I need to have a monastery? How do you start? Well, and this is just a layout of what we're going to cover. The location of the monastery is, of course, key. The location is key not only from a sort of strategic and historical standpoint, but it's also important because you have to have the land, right? So to found a monastic institution, you need to have money, of course, but you also need to have the land to put it on. So where does one have land, or can one buy land or trade land? The order. So order is simply, what kind of lifestyle will these monks or nuns have? How will they live? What are their vows? What is their vocation? So you have to choose an order. And this is in some ways a very political thing, right? Because monastic orders at this time were extremely powerful. So who you align yourself with is in itself a strategic move. Who controls what order? Do they answer to the Pope? Do they answer to an abbot in France? So all of these choices are very important. Then permissions. So you've chosen your order. Now you need to have permission to found the monastery and determine who is going to regulate it. Then you get building, which is my favorite part, and I'll get to that in a minute. And that's when you actually come up with a physical structure and construct it. And this is when you get to make choices about what it looks like, its style, how the people in it live. And then you set a precedent. And this is where the lasting part of my title here comes into play. One doesn't want to build a monastery that's only going to last 50 years or even 100 years. One wants to build a monastery that's going to last as long as possible, 1,000 years, more, forever. And as we will see, Sancha was very good at building a lasting monastery. There's monks or nuns there now, and there were nuns there, as we will see in the next lecture, all the way up into the 20th century. And she, I think, built a lasting foundation because she set very clear precedents. Why does this matter for our friend Master of Sigena? Because nuns knew their history. They knew the history of their institution, and they were hyper aware of their own institutional memory. So the nuns who commissioned the Master of Sigena to make an altarpiece in the 16th century were aware of their founder, Sancha of Castile, in the 12th. So just to start, location, location, location. So here's where we are. This is just to orient you. This is, on the left is the region of Spain I'm talking about. This is the modern area of Aragon. And then on the right, I'm homed in on the province of Huesca. In this absolutely terrible image, so I'm sorry, we will move on quickly, but I wanted to show you Sigena is right here. And here's Huesca, Lérida, Zaragoza, Tortosa, Tarragona, Barcelona, all these really important cities, right? And you can see how the Islamic Taifa kingdoms here in the gray area have been pushed further and further south by the time we're talking about at the end of the 12th century. So here's a modern Google Maps. And I wanted to show you this because the monastery looks really, really out of the way, like it's in the middle of nowhere. And it was, in the sense that it was a swamp. There was already a town there. There were already some churches there. But it's actually really, for the late 12th century, a very strategic location because it's right sort of in the middle of these very important cities, important for historical reasons, important for ecclesiastical reasons. So here we have Huesca with its bishop. We have Zaragoza, which was conquered from the Taifa kingdom earlier in the century. So we're in a sort of frontier border type area. We're right along the river Ebro here. And here's Tarragona, Lleda's around here-ish somewhere. Maybe that's it. And then Barcelona. So what we're really on, even though it looks like the middle of nowhere, and goodness knows it is kind of the middle of nowhere today, it's actually a really strategic location. It's a crossroads. Sancha wanted this strategic location so badly that she drained a swamp and moved a town. So, and it's on the Camino de Santiago, which I just love. So this is a way to get this part of the Camino, I should say, not the Camino Frances where you'd come down up here. So actually, this is a very strategic location and very carefully chosen. Sancha had to trade some of her ancestral land, some of the land she'd inherited, with land in this area and purchase it. She also had to acquire churches that were already there that belonged to the Templars, the Knights Templar, so a monastic order. And then, like I said, move a town and drain a swamp. So this was a very strategic and important location. So now she has to pick an order, and oh, which one to choose? So I just love this idea of like kind of picturing her choosing an order. And the tried and true option would, of course, be the Benedictine order. It's the oldest monastic order. It's extremely well established in Spain. I just threw up a slide here of San Domingo de Silos, excuse me, in Burgos, which is a very old and very well established Benedictine house that still operates. You may have heard their chant. This is its wonderful Romanesque cloister. So in some ways, that would have been a very safe option. But there's also these up and coming monastic orders at the time, particularly at the end of the 12th century. One is the Cistercians, and the Cistercians are simply a reform order of the Benedictine order. The Cistercians were sort of saying these Benedictines are getting out of control, they're living the high life, they're not staying celibate, they're being super naughty. We need to pull it back a notch and go back to the kind of foundational vows of the order. And so the Cistercians were kind of known for being more strict. But then there's also these up and coming orders that are the military orders. So these are the orders that were born of, let's see, I think I have a slide, born of crusade. So the one you've probably heard of, most famously, are the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar were formed to protect pilgrims and to fight the crusade in the Holy Land. Shortly after the Templars, we have the Order of the Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, also known as the Knights of Malta. So it's a really long title, but as the name implies, this monastic order set up hospitals in the Holy Land. So their actual kind of raison d'etre, their reason for operating, was to help the pilgrims when they get to the Holy Land. So if you arrive and you're sick or injured, or maybe you know you won't make the journey back, you could go to a hospital or hospice of the Order of St. John. They did become a little bit more militant later when they started actually protecting pilgrims, so in a more, let's say, bellicose way. But they started out with this kind of charitable giving. The Templars didn't have a female order, but the Knights of St. John did. And Sancha, founding this order and planning to one day join it and to have control over it, of course, she wanted a female house, and she chose the Order of the Hospital of St. John, which was relatively new. So this is, again, a kind of up-and-coming order founded in 1113. And this is just the charter of the foundation on the right, and a gooby print of, you know, some habits later with this telltale cross that you can see with the bifurcated ends that tells you that we're talking about this order. I just put this up so we'd have some fun eye candy. These are nuns at Sigena in the 19th or early 20th century, excuse me, of the order, and you can see this again, that cross of Malta on their habits. So reasons for choosing this order are fascinating in that, there we go, yes, oops, there we go. Why the Knights of St. John? So why does she choose this kind of up and coming order that does have a female branch, but not super commonly? It's not like there were a lot of monasteries dedicated to this order in Spain already. But the historical situation promoted this foundation in the sense that Aragon knew the Crusades were going on, and they also knew they were fighting Muslim Taifa kingdoms in Iberia. There had been papal bulls that associated the wars in Iberia with the Crusades, so you could get the same kind of rewards for participating, for fighting in the Iberian theater versus in the Holy Land itself. And so there's this idea that kind of twofold here, which is the military orders are in the Holy Land. What do they need to keep fighting their battle? They need money. So they're looking at Iberia thinking, oh, this is great if we can get some money from our monasteries here, from pilgrims, from donors like Sancha and all this, we can send it back to help our battle in the Holy Land. On the other side, in Aragon, they're thinking, okay, yeah, that's great, but also, wouldn't it be great if we could get some help fighting our own war here? So it's this kind of fascinating mutual relationship between the military orders and particularly the Crown of Aragón, where they're looking for relationships that are mutually beneficial. In Castile and Leon, the Cistercian order would become much more popular, and this is partly due to political relationships with France rather than political relationships maybe in the Mediterranean. So whereas the Cistercians become more popular in Castile, these military orders, and particularly the military orders associated with the Holy Land itself, are starting to be more popular in Aragon. So there's a very politically expedient reason, I love this, for picking the Order of the Knights of St. John, right? So that's the historical situation. She's kind of showing herself to be quite clever, I think, here. The other reason, and these words maybe don't look like they mean much, Castellan de Imposta, Pope, and the Bishop of Huesca. So this is this question about when you pick an order, who do you answer to? In this case, Sancha was very clever. She worked it out so that she could have, her monastery could have relative autonomy. The prioress of the monastery could operate relatively independently. This is important because depending on other orders, you may answer, like I said earlier, to an abbot in France, to a bishop. You know, you have pesky men meddling in your situation, basically. And what Sancha did very cleverly that she worked out is that she would, yes, in some respects, answer to the Castellan de Amposta. That's simply the head of the entire Order of the Knights of St. John. But then she has some things that she only has to go to the Pope for. So that's like really going to the top. And then she has a good relationship with the Bishop of Huesca, which we know from the map is very close. So she's got a really good kind of, she's established a really clever path to maintain autonomy and independence from, compared to, say, a much more strict order. The other kind of really fascinating thing, and maybe this only matters if you're kind of really into monastic history, but reasons for choosing this order are also fascinating from the sense of what nuns do all day. What do nuns do all day? Depends on which order you're in, right? So the Knights of St. John, they had already pretty much followed the rule of St. Augustine. St. Augustine's rule was kind of like guidelines, you know, pray a lot, charity, how, you know, care for the sick, hospitality, this sort of thing. But it didn't outline what you do in your day-to-day life, like the contemplative orders do, like the Benedictines and the Cistercians. So what she did is, and I just love this, she created a hybrid. She said, okay, we have the rule of Augustine. That's great. That gives us basic guidelines. But then she commissions the Bishop of Huesca to write a customary. And a customary is like, it's just like some amendments. So you have this rule of Augustine, which is like, let's say, the American Constitution. And then you say, okay, but we want to amend a few things, you know. And the customary amends those things to give the nuns a sort of guideline for daily life. And for that, they follow the big Benedictines. And that's what I have up here is just, and this is again from Silos, but you can see how their time is divided between work and prayers, essentially. And different kinds of prayers at different times a day. And Sancha was very hands-on with this, with the Bishop of Huesca and writing this sort of amended customary. So what's fascinating about this is she takes a kind of active order, an order that is more typically out and about, and she combines it with a contemplative order that has a very strict schedule of prayer. Her monastery, as the name implies, was for royal women. So royal and women of the high nobility. And this comes across again and again in Sancha's letters and correspondence because she stipulates how women of rank are to be treated, who can be the prioress, how the prioress is selected, which, by the way, is by vote of the fellow nuns, not appointed by the Pope, not appointed by the Castellan. So we have this wonderful idea, and this is a quotation from the document. I don't usually like slides with a bunch of text, but in this format, hopefully you can read it a little bit. But this is from the actual foundation document where she talks about forming the monastery in the order of the hospital, as you can see here. And then you can see for the aforesaid manor called Cordong and the village and monastery of Sigena. So we have this, she's trading land and possessions to be able to found this monastery. And then again, for the construction and erection of a monastery and house of ladies. And I think ladies is important. We're not talking about women from poorer echelons of society. These are noble women. La la la, blessed John the Baptist. So, you know, the John of the Order of St. John is that John, it's John the Baptist. And then of course she missions with an additional rule, which I add of course to that of St. Augustine. So in her foundational document, she says, I've added, you know, I've amended with this customary, the rule of St. Augustine for my nuns. So I'm just trying to give you a sense of like how very hands-on she was. And again, these documents, and I'll get to this a little bit later, the document that I'm quoting here, this would have been known to the nuns in Sigena. These things are in the archives. So it'd be like going to, you know, the archive I have in my backyard, which is Hammond, and pulling out a book about the history of the Meadows Museum. This is stuff that is in everybody's minds, even centuries later. So now we get to the fun part, which is get building. And of course there's, as I said, she had to clear a swamp, she had to move a town, or rather have it done, let's say. She wasn't doing it herself, that's for sure. And decide what it looks like. I mean, these are really fascinating decisions of, you're starting from scratch. What do you want this thing to look like? You know, she was very particular in choosing the order, the rule, amending the rule, the location. And so I think we should acknowledge that the way the building looks was also carefully considered, right? And here are just some shots so you can get a sense of the site. I love this portal. And so again, we're talking about 1187, 88 when building gets started. As I said before, there are Templar churches in the area that she managed to procure. So the nuns from the get-go had a place to worship already. There was already a consecrated space, where priests could come and say mass, but they needed a place to live. And so what's interesting is that this building actually started with the dormitories, which is number 4 on this map. Normally when you build a monastery, particularly a male monastery, you would begin with the church, because the most important thing is having a consecrated space to say mass. They already had that in these Templar churches, so they were able to begin with the monasteries. And there seems to be a kind of urgency to get them in. This is a fairly quick building process by medieval standards. We have evidence that nuns were able to move in even probably before the 1190s. So we're moving very quickly here. And so again, this is just, the question is, why do things look the way they look? So we're seeing lots of rounded arches. We're not seeing a lot of sculpture. We're seeing no sculpture, in fact. The archivolts are extravagant and gorgeous. I mean, there's 15 or something of them there. But again, no sculpture. So not like when you think of the pilgrimage churches. Here's some wonderful solid arches as well. But again, asking just simple questions. Why do things look the way they look? This is strong ashlar masonry. This is beautiful limestone. We're not using brick. This is meant to last, even though it's going up fast. This is the nave. There's a little bit of a point on these arches. So here's the question. We're at the end of the 12th century. Why does this building look like this with its round arches and, you know, row of corbels and all of this, and not like this? This dates to around the same time period. This is the Cathedral of Sens in France, and very clearly Gothic. It has all those bits and pieces we associate with the Gothic. Pointed arches, height, stained glass windows, all of that. So it's interesting to think that in this case, or these, for example, and these are Spanish examples. This is Las Huelgas, which is absolutely contemporary, also has a female patron. in Burgos. And then on the right, from about 20 years later, from when it was started, is the Cathedral of Leon, which looks like a French Gothic building that could have been picked up and slapped down in Spain. So why is she choosing the Romanesque? And this is where I get to my, or the language of the Romanesque. And this is where I get to my kind of concept of substance as style. It's important to think about why things look the way they look. And we call this Romanesque, but it's kind of transition Gothic. And I think because of that, there hasn't been a ton of research on the architecture of this building. And part of that is because we don't know what to do with it. We're at the end of the 12th century. Why doesn't it look more Gothic? So is it a deliberately antiquated style? But there's also some other fascinating reasons. This is still an area that's experiencing some armed conflict. So this may function better as a fortress. It's also built really quickly. And so we don't have a lot of time spent on fancy sculpture and things like that. That decoration is saved for later. And some of the most famous decoration from this church. So we get the building up quickly, we build it in a solid way that's going to last forever, but we didn't spend time with masonry, with sculpture. And so what did we do? The nuns could move in while other decorations were being done. This is the chapter house, which was once decorated, you can see in this early photo, I hope, absolutely covered with frescoes. This is a 18th century watercolor. And so you can see that even though they did all these things to get the building up quickly, make it solid, make it feel fortified, they thoroughly decorated the inside. And what's lovely is this is something that could have been done once the nuns were already in there, was these frescoes being painted. I won't discuss the frescoes very much. Oddly enough, they're probably the most publicized, most studied aspect of this building. And so for further reading, just let me know. I'm happy to send it to you. So we've done all the other things on my list, and now we have to set precedent. So this is when Sancha sets about making this institution last and making sure it will have an influence into the future. One of the ways she does this is she tries to create a royal pantheon. And this is what you're looking at here in this photo. This means she committed to being buried here. And her hope was that other members of the Aragonese royalty would be as well. Her husband, actually, in the end, who died in 1196, would choose to be buried somewhere else. He went the Cistercian route, not the St. John route. And he ended up in Poblet, which I think is must have been a funny marital, conversation. But Sancha does get her son to be buried there. Her son, she acted as regent for her son. Sancha lived about 10 years longer than her husband. So that's a long time to be a widow. She never remarried. She acted as regent for her son before he came of age. And very soon after Alfonso died and Sancha's son, Pedro, came along, he committed to being buried at Sigena. So the location of royal bodies is important for many reasons. It establishes this place as a seat of royal authority, and it means that the memory of these people will be perpetually commemorated. So the nuns aren't just living with Sancha's documents and her rule, they're living with her remains, and they're living with constant saying of masses for her soul and in her honor. So this is a place where memory really matters, thanks to physical presence and because of this kind of legacy that would have been important for the nuns themselves. So we have a royal pantheon, and then we have the archive, which is one of the most, I have to say, fascinating things I found, got ahead of myself, that I found out when I was working on preparing for this lecture was Sigena's archive became one of the most important in Aragon in the centuries following Sancha's death. And this is partly because of the importance of the noble women who were there, partly because it had this wonderful kind of fortification aspect. So you could lock down these documents and keep them safe. And eventually, bits of the archive would be moved in later centuries, both in the Middle Ages and the early modern and modern period, to other parts of the empire, to Barcelona, to Huesca, even to Madrid later on. But in this time period, the importance of this archive is partly, I think, what made this monastery so important over time. So these are precedents that that Sancha set that would have an important legacy. So Sancha, as I said, she was regent to her son Peter II, but after her husband died in 1196, she herself took vows as a nun in the order. And so I put this goofy cross of Malta on here, but she took vows as a nun. She wasn't the prioress, so she still would have, in theory, had to answer to the prioress. But we have tons of documentation where Sancha, even before she goes to live in the monastery, dictates the hierarchy of women within the monastery. So even though the prioress is the most important, and nobody could ignore her, she did make very clear pronouncements about where women within the monastery could sit or how they process based on rank. So secular, that is to say royal or noble, aristocratic rank, was maintained within the monastery. And so, yes, we have Sancha taking vows as a nun, and that's fabulous, but she's not doing manual labor. She's not even living in the monastery the whole time. We have tons of documents as well. This place was built on a swamp. It was horribly unhealthy. And so enclosure was very rarely maintained. The nuns could go home periodically. So they are doing their thing and praying and, you know, all this stuff, but they're also going out into the world. So Sancha's legacy. We have this obviously wonderful building. We have this wonderful building, this wonderful archive. But now we're going to fast forward, and I already gave you a preview of that, to the late 14th, early 15th century. The monastery at this point is still going strong. It's still a place for royal and noble women. It's pretty much operating in the way Sancha had intended it. It was still getting royal burials, not all of them, but many of them, particularly from Aragonese kings or Catalonia. And so it's still very kind of powerful, and I would say fitting the spirit of Sancha. But then this really horrible thing happens, which is a war of succession with the Trastámaras, excuse me. And this is the problem, right? When you have a monastery that's so tied to the local nobility and to the local royalty, when you have a schism in power, you have to pick sides. And in this case, Sigena backed the wrong horse, if you pardon the expression. So basically, we have this fellow, Conde Jaime II de Urgel, who I love his little descriptor, or moniker, which is El Desafortunado, the unfortunate. And so he was on one side, he was one potential heir to the throne, and there was another potential heir to the throne as well. And Jaime II de Urgel's sister, Isabel, was the prioress of Sigena, right? So of course she's going to back her brother. Well, the monastery was actually completely divided, and this was a major conflict within Sigena, right? The women who wanted to back the Trastámaras and the ones who wanted to back the Count of Urgel. And this was a big problem with the nuns being divided. With the Compromiso de Caspe in 1412, it was decided that we were going to go with the Trastámara line. And that meant Fernando I, which is the first Fernando after we get Fernando II of Aragon, who's the Catholic king. So this is when that line that is both Fernando II of Aragon and Isabella, the Catholic. So both the Catholic kings, they were second cousins, descended from this line. So this is kind of pivotal moment in Aragonese history when this family comes into power. And Sigena, very famously, backed the wrong side. So after this Compromiso de Caspa was signed in 1412, poor Sigena became a prison. And I love the kind of metaphor, because this was a place where you were in theory enclosed, but you weren't really enclosed. And at this point, it actually became an enclosure. And this is where this kind of fortification aspect, I think, of the architecture takes on a different turn. So now we're jumping very quickly into the 15th century. And these are just a few points I wanted to make. First is about Jews, Muslims, and Conversos in Sigena. One of the fascinating things I came across in my research was that there is documentation of the involvement of people of different confessions throughout the history of the monastery. There's evidence that Sancha herself contracted Muslim craftsmen to work on the construction of the monastery of Sigena itself. There's multiple documents relating to the Jewish neighborhood, the Juderia in Huesca, which is a very famous Jewish neighborhood there. And one of the neighborhoods within that, in the Juderia, was actually called Sigena. And this is because the monastery had given that land to the Jews to build houses on in exchange for tribute. So there's, and then there's documentation, and I'm still not sure what entirely to make of this, but there's also documentation of the prioress of, and other even male priests and things like that associated with the monastery, giving Jewish craftsmen in particular, or Jews, to other institutions. So there's this kind of trade of people and skills that is also documented here. So I'm bringing this up just so you know, this isn't a fully 100% Christian story, even though it seems that way. Everybody is still kind of negotiating and working together in some way. And this takes us up into the middle to late 15th century, when there's evidence of a number of nuns. Again, this is still an elite, royal, aristocratic monastery. A number of nuns are very clearly not Conversos themselves, but descended from Conversos. So they had, this means that their mother was Jewish or Muslim, in the cases that I found Jewish. She converted to Christianity, in many cases married a Christian, or maybe married another Converso, and then the daughter came into, sorry, I'm just checking my time, and the daughter joined this elite institution. And what's fascinating is this is very different from Castile. Castile had much harsher conditions much earlier for the treatment of Conversos. And we have the Inquisitions founded in 1484. It takes a little longer to have so much control in Aragon as it did in Castile. And these things called limpieza de sangre, which literally means pureness of blood, which are documents that proved that you weren't from a Converso family. They proved you were a so-called old Christian. They were much less common as early in Aragon. And so at this kind of pivotal moment in the mid 15th century, Sigena doesn't really care, right? They're taking in these Conversas, and they're not asking for limpieza de sangre, but that does happen later. So there is in the archive from Sigena certificates of purity of blood, but they happen a bit later than they did in Castile. And then we get to the point that they did finally back the right horse. And, this is a full 100 years later. So in some ways, it maybe took them a little while to return, or to recover. But by this time, the monastery is fully behind our wonderful friend from the Tratas Maras, Fernando II, who of course would marry Isabella of Castile and join Aragon and Castile for the first time. And then of course Charles I, who we will talk more about in our next lecture. So this is where we get to, this is just a kind of pitch for the next lecture, which is Sigena being behind Fernando II. Again, there's going to be a number of wars of succession when Isabella and Ferdinand take control. And then even when Charles I, so King of Spain, later Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, he's Fernando and Isabella's grandson. When he comes to take power, there's a lot of shuffling. And Sigena is still playing a role in this because they needed the noble families of Aragon to be on their side. One of those families was the Urreas, and I will be focusing on them much more next week, because now we are at the point where we have a new prioress of of Sigena in the 16th century and a new kind of style of art that she's going to commission. So again, preview for next week. Here's our panel on the left. Here's a clunky reconstruction on the right. But when we talk about new styles and what they mean and why the women who commission them choose why things look, this is something to start thinking about as well, and remembering that styles are not a linear progression or an evolution and things like that. And we've gone from this kind of what now looks quite austere Romanesque architecture, which would have been slightly antiquated for the time, to something like this. This is not the altarpiece from Sigena, I'm afraid, but I wanted to show you this to you so you would see what an intact altarpiece from the time period looked like. So imagine our beautiful panel with its simple little frame in something like this, and a wonderful prioress at this amazing royal monastery commissioning it. So please let me know if you have any questions, and thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda, for getting us through so many centuries. So
yeah, I know, I feel like I was like going a century a second.
Well, this is the time that we can take questions, and it's just a reminder, we're going to be using the chat box as the space to communicate any questions you have. So if you're searching for that, you should see kind of a speech bubble that comes out, an icon that looks like a speech bubble that you can click on to pull up your chat box and share any questions that you have there. Okay, so we have one question as well as some thank yous, but one question is about the monastery and whether it's still active.
Yes, so this is a kind of somewhat complicated story that I will get into in much more detail next week. Next week I'll start in the 16th and I'll go all the way up through the 21st, through 2016 maybe, when we acquired the panel. But yeah, so it operates, I mean, more or less somewhat the same way, you know, royal favor ebbs and flows as we have seen. The rule that Sancha set up that I spent so much time explaining, it's not amended until the middle of the 16th century. So this is sort of my justification for why does the 12th century matter when we're talking about a 16th century panel, is this sort of continuity. And like I said, I don't want too many spoilers for next week, but by the 19th century, there's a series of things that happen that lead to the spoliation of monastic properties. Sigena is not exempt, but the nuns sort of hang on. It's never as black and white as we would like it to be. And part of the reason for that, I've discovered, is that this rule of enclosure is not enforced, not in the Middle Ages and not in the modern period. And so when we say, are there nuns there? It's like, well, you know, yeah, there's nuns associated with Sigena, but they might not actually be living there, certainly not full time. And it may be a very small group. So I think by the modern period, we get down to much fewer nuns, and then some sort of trading happens. I think, and I'll confirm this next week, but I think the nuns associated with Sigena now were brought in from outside of Spain. And this happened a lot in Spain. So Silos, which I also talked about, when it was nationalized in the 19th century, it lost its monks, but then they brought French Benedictines in later. And so the monks that are at Silos now, if you go there now and you see them, or if you buy a CD of the Gregorian chant, those are the French transplants that came in the later 19th century. So Sigena is a little bit like that. Basically by the early 19th century, things start to get a bit squidgy. And I'll focus on that next week.
Great, thank you.
Not really an answer, yes and no.
Well, we have a few more questions that I think are people who maybe missed, you know, they didn't write down a date or missed the name of something. So I guess I just want to let the group know that we have been recording this lecture. And my plan is to package that and get it out to everyone that has registered for this program in the next day or so that you would have a chance to watch if you would like to, again, before the next lecture. So you can always go back and rewatch, but I will go ahead and share some of those questions with Amanda. So I think Terry was interested in the date that Sancha died, and
Sure.
the date that the order backed the wrong horse.
Okay, so Sancha dies in 1208, right? So you can see how long of a period after, between 1196 and 1208, where she's a widow, but also during part of that time acting as regent to Peter. The backing the wrong horse story. So you can see the life dates of Jaime de Urgel here, and the Compromise of 1412. So all of this is going down in the years leading up to 1412. So you could say 1410, thereabouts, that sort of thing. 1412 is when the decision is made to go with the Trastámaras instead of the Count of Urgel. So that's the kind of terminus antequem, as they say.
Great.
But if you want to be squidgy, you can just say, you know, second decade of the 15th century.
So Amanda, the unusual head coverings that the nuns were wearing in the photo you shared, do you have any background information on those?
No, but hopefully I will by next week. They are very curious, are they not? We don't have a lot of evidence of what they would have worn before this early 20th century photo. But yeah, hopefully watch this space. Hopefully I'll have more for you next week. It's a very curious habit. And, you know, just as a side note, there aren't a ton of female hospitaller monasteries in Spain. This was not the very first, but it was the first one that survived and caught on, and certainly the most powerful one. So it became the mother house for all female hospitaller convents in Iberia, or in Spain, excuse me. So, but there's not that many. Again, we're not talking about other kind of more popular female orders like the Poor Clares or that sort of thing. So yeah, I'm not sure where that comes from, but I will hopefully have more to tell you next week, by which time we can talk about the 20th century.
Great. So I think we have one more question that we'll end with before I would like to share some information about upcoming programs. But Howard was interested, when you were speaking about the architecture of the monastery, you mentioned there were 15 somethings. He didn't catch the word. What were you referring to?
These crazy things, which are called archivolts. So that is basically, so you have these columns here at the bottom. That's describing what this is. So this is an arch for a doorway. It's actually doing something, right? You can walk through it. It's supporting the stones above. But all these others are just fun. They're not serving any, you know, serious load-bearing purpose. So rather than arch, we're calling them archivolt, which is this weird word. But I encourage you, if you're curious, to Google it, and there are wonderful kind of architectural drawings that like point all this stuff out. So it's this kind of bizarre combination of ostentation, but in the architecture itself, rather than ostentation by covering it with sculpture, which is what you get in the pilgrimage churches. So if anyone can picture like Santiago de Compostela or even San Isidro de Leon, these that have all this like sculpture on the front. No sculpture here. There's no morality tales. There's no last judgment. There's no nothing. It's really kind of this kind of pure, would have been painted, but you know, not as lavishly as figural sculpture. Kind of pure celebration of an exuberant Romanesque, let's say.
Well, Amanda, thank you so much for your time this morning, for all the work you put into preparing part one of our two-part lecture series. And I want to thank everyone for attending our very first virtual lecture this fall. Before